Maria Santos had been preparing for this day for 8 months. The annual 50-kilometer charity march through the mountains of her small town in Colombia was more than just a fundraising event. It was her chance to prove that a 17-year-old girl from the poorest neighborhood could compete with anyone. The prize money of $5,000 would pay for her final year of high school and maybe even help her younger brother get the medical treatment he desperately needed. She woke up at 4 in the morning, her stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and nerves. The old alarm clock her grandmother had given her buzzed loudly in the tiny room she shared with her 3 sisters. Maria carefully stepped over their sleeping forms and made her way to the kitchen, where she had laid out her gear the night before. Her hiking boots sat prominently on the wooden table. They weren't new or expensive, but they were hers. She had saved every peso from her weekend job at the local market, collecting coins in an old coffee tin until she had enough to buy them second-hand from a sports shop in the city. The leather was worn but still strong, and she had spent hours breaking them in during her training walks through the hills surrounding their village. Maria's mother, Carmen, was already awake, preparing a simple breakfast of rice and beans. She said softly, "Are you sure about this? It's a long way, and there will be people there with much better equipment than you." "Mama, I've been training for months," Maria replied, lacing up her precious boots. "My legs are strong, and my heart is stronger. Besides, what's the worst that could happen?" The march would begin at sunrise from the town square. Participants had been arriving all week. Some were serious athletes with professional gear. Others were wealthy business people looking for a challenge, and a few were locals like Maria who saw this as an opportunity to change their lives. The route would take them through 3 mountain passes, across 2 rivers, and through some of the most beautiful but challenging terrain in the region. As Maria walked to the starting point, her boots felt perfect on her feet. She had worn 2 pairs of socks to prevent blisters, and had carefully waterproofed the leather the week before. Every step felt confident and sure. She carried a small backpack with water, some fruit, and a first aid kit her mother had insisted on packing. The town square was buzzing with activity when she arrived. Television crews were setting up their equipment, and volunteers were handing out race numbers and checking equipment. Maria received number 47 and pinned it to her simple cotton t-shirt. She looked around at the other participants and felt a moment of doubt. Many wore expensive athletic clothing and carried high-tech hydration systems. Their boots alone probably cost more than her family made in a month. Among the crowd, she noticed a group of young men from the wealthy part of town. They were laughing loudly and pointing at some of the local participants, making jokes about their amateur equipment. Their leader, a boy named Ricardo who was known throughout the town for his family's money and his cruel sense of humor, caught sight of Maria. "Look at this," he said to his friends, loud enough for Maria to hear. "The market girl thinks she can compete with real athletes." Maria kept her head down and tried to focus on her breathing exercises. Her father had always told her that words from small people couldn't make her any smaller. She checked her bootlaces one more time and took a sip of water from her bottle. The race organizer, a respected former marathon runner named Don Alberto, climbed onto a small platform to address the participants. "Today, you will test not just your physical strength, but your mental determination," he announced. "The mountains will challenge you in ways you cannot imagine. Some of you will discover strength you never knew you had. Others will learn that preparation and respect for nature are just as important as fitness." As Don Alberto continued his speech about safety and sportsmanship, Maria felt someone bump into her roughly from behind. She turned to see Ricardo and his friends pushing through the crowd. "Excuse me," she said politely. But Ricardo just smirked. "Save your energy for the walk, market girl. You'll need it." The starting horn was scheduled for 6 o'clock sharp. Participants began gathering behind the starting line, stretching and making final adjustments to their gear. Maria found a spot toward the back of the group, knowing that the experienced runners would set a pace she couldn't match initially. Her strategy was to maintain a steady rhythm and let others burn themselves out in the early stages. With 5 minutes to go, she decided to visit the portable restroom one last time. She carefully removed her boots and placed them just outside the door, as was customary to keep the facilities clean. It was a decision that would change everything. When she emerged less than 3 minutes later, her boots were gone. Maria stared at the empty space where her boots had been, her mind struggling to process what had happened. She looked around frantically, hoping someone had moved them by mistake, but there was no sign of the worn leather boots anywhere. "Has anyone seen my boots?" she called out desperately to nearby participants. A few people shook their heads sympathetically, but most were too focused on their own pre-race preparations to pay attention. The starting horn would sound in less than 2 minutes. Maria's eyes scanned the crowd and landed on Ricardo and his friends. Ricardo was bent over, adjusting something on his feet, and when he stood up, Maria caught a glimpse of familiar worn leather. He had somehow managed to put her boots on over his own expensive footwear, making them look like some kind of strange, double-layered system. "Those are my boots," she shouted, pushing through the crowd toward him. Ricardo looked up with mock innocence. "These old things? I found them lying around. Someone must have thrown them away. You know they're mine. I need them for the march." "Prove it," Ricardo said with a cruel smile. "Besides, the race starts in 1 minute. Even if these were yours, which they're not, there's no time to sort this out now." Maria felt tears of frustration welling up in her eyes. Months of preparation, months of dreaming about changing her family's situation, and now this. The other participants were already moving toward the starting line. Don Alberto's voice boomed over the loudspeaker. 30 seconds. All participants to the starting line." Maria looked down at her bare feet, then at the rocky mountain trail that stretched into the distance. The path would take her over sharp stones, through muddy streams, and across terrain that would be challenging even with proper footwear. A reasonable person would quit. A sensible person would file a complaint and try to get into next year's march. But Maria Santos had never been interested in being reasonable when her family's future was at stake. She walked to the starting line in her bare feet. The other participants noticed her missing footwear and began murmuring among themselves. Some looked concerned. Others seemed amused by what they assumed was some kind of mistake or last-minute equipment failure. Don Alberto noticed too. He approached Maria with a worried expression. "Señorita, where are your shoes? You cannot participate in this march without proper footwear. The terrain is too dangerous." Maria looked him straight in the eyes. "Sir, I've been training for this for months. My family is counting on me. I know the risks, and I accept them. Please don't disqualify me for something that isn't my fault." Don Alberto studied her face for a long moment. He saw determination there, but also desperation. "The medical team will be monitoring everyone closely," he said finally. "If you're injured, you'll be pulled from the course immediately. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir. Thank you." 10 seconds, came the announcement. Maria positioned herself at the starting line, her bare toes gripping the cool morning dirt. Around her, dozens of properly equipped participants bounced on their expensive running shoes and hiking boots. She could feel their eyes on her, could hear the whispered conversations about the crazy girl who thought she could march 50 kilometers without shoes. Ricardo stood a few meters to her right, her stolen boots clearly visible on his feet. He caught her looking and gave her a mocking wave. The starting horn blasted across the square, and Maria Santos began to run. The first kilometer was through the town streets, and the pavement felt surprisingly comfortable under her feet. She had spent countless hours as a child running around the neighborhood without shoes, and her feet were tougher than most people's. The early morning air was cool, which helped keep her feet from getting too hot. But Maria knew the real challenge lay ahead. Once they left the paved roads and entered the mountain trails, every step would be a test of her endurance and willpower. Sharp rocks, thorny plants, muddy patches, and stream crossings awaited her. As they reached the edge of town and the trail began to climb into the hills, Maria settled into a steady rhythm. She had studied this route extensively during her training. She knew where the difficult sections were, where she could rest, and where she would need to push herself hardest. The pack of runners began to spread out as they hit the first incline. The serious athletes pulled ahead, while the casual participants started to fall behind. Maria maintained her position in the middle of the group, focusing on her breathing and trying not to think about her feet. By the third kilometer, she could feel the difference the missing boots made. Small pebbles pressed into her soles, and she had to pick her way carefully over the rougher sections of trail. But she was still moving, still keeping pace with many of the other participants. Other marchers began to notice her determination. A middle-aged woman running nearby called out, "You're incredible, honey. How are you doing this without shoes?" "One step at a time," Maria called back, managing a smile despite the growing discomfort in her feet. Word of the Barefoot girl began to spread through the pack of participants. Some expressed admiration. Others thought she was foolish. But everyone was talking about her. The television crew, following in vehicles along the accessible portions of the route, took notice and began filming her progress. By the 5th kilometer, Maria's feet were definitely feeling the impact. She could feel small cuts forming on her heels and toes, and her soles were beginning to bruise from the constant contact with rocks and roots. But the adrenaline of the race and the support from other participants kept her moving forward. She passed Ricardo at the 7-kilometer mark. He had started fast but was already struggling with the pace, and the extra weight and awkwardness of wearing her boots over his own shoes was clearly affecting his performance. When he saw her approaching, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Still think this is funny?" Maria asked as she jogged past him, her voice steady, despite her fatigue. Ricardo had no response. He was breathing heavily and falling further behind with each step. As the trail climbed higher into the mountains, the terrain became more challenging. The path was littered with loose rocks, and Maria had to concentrate intensely on every footfall. One wrong step on a sharp stone could end her march immediately. At the 10-kilometer checkpoint, a volunteer offered her water and asked if she needed medical attention. "My feet are holding up," Maria told them, though she could feel moisture that she knew was blood mixing with the sweat on her soles. The volunteer looked down at her feet with concern. "Are you sure you want to continue? We have vehicles that can take you back to town." Maria shook her head firmly. "I'm not quitting. Not today." As she left the checkpoint and headed toward the first major climb of the course, Maria could feel the eyes of other participants on her. Some looked at her with respect, others with concern, and a few with the kind of admiration reserved for people doing something that seems impossible. The mountain trail stretched ahead, winding up through pine forests and rocky outcroppings toward the first pass. Maria took a deep breath, adjusted her small backpack, and continued her march. Each step was becoming more painful, but each step was also bringing her closer to proving that determination could overcome almost any obstacle. Behind her, Ricardo had stopped at the checkpoint to complain about blisters and was seriously considering dropping out of the march. The boots he had stolen were causing him more problems than he had anticipated, and watching Maria pass him while running barefoot was destroying his confidence. Ahead of her, the real test was just beginning. The mountain passes would push her to her limits. But Maria Santos had come too far to give up now. Her bare feet had carried her this far, and somehow, she believed they would carry her all the way to the finish line. The first major climb began at kilometer 12, where the trail turned sharply upward towards Cerro del Aguila, the highest point on the course. Maria's feet were now seriously hurting, but she had found a rhythm that allowed her to keep moving forward. She picked her steps carefully, looking for patches of softer earth and avoiding the sharpest rocks when possible. As she climbed, she began to encounter other participants who were struggling. The altitude was starting to affect some of the less prepared marchers, and the steep incline was separating the serious athletes from the weekend warriors. Maria found herself passing people who had expensive gear but lacked the mental toughness the mountains demanded. "How are you doing this?" gasped a businessman who was leaning against a tree, his face red with exertion. He was wearing boots that probably cost more than Maria's family made in 2 months, but he looked ready to quit. "I have something to prove," Maria replied simply, not slowing down. At the 15-kilometer mark, she encountered her first serious obstacle. A small stream crossed the trail, fed by mountain runoff that made the water icy cold. The other participants were using stepping stones to cross, but many of the stones were unstable or slippery. For Maria, this presented a unique challenge. Her bare feet would have no traction on the wet rocks, and a fall could seriously injure her. She stood at the stream's edge for a moment, watching other marchers navigate the crossing. An elderly man named Don Carlos, who was participating in his 20th march, noticed her hesitation. "The water's not too deep, Nina," he said kindly. Maybe it would be safer for you to just walk through it. Maria nodded gratefully and stepped into the stream. The icy water was a shock to her system, but it also felt wonderful on her bruised and cut feet. The cold numbed the pain temporarily and washed away the blood and dirt that had accumulated over the first 15 kilometers. As she emerged from the stream, she felt refreshed and somehow stronger. The cold water had given her feet a brief respite, and she realized that the streams along the route might actually help her rather than hinder her progress. Don Carlos caught up with her on the other side. "That was smart thinking," he said, slightly out of breath. "You're using your disadvantage as an advantage." "My grandmother always said that every problem contains its own solution," Maria replied. "You just have to look at it from a different angle." They walked together for the next few kilometers, and Don Carlos shared stories from his previous marches. He had seen participants overcome incredible obstacles over the years, but he had never seen anyone attempt the course barefoot. "What made you decide to do this without shoes?" he asked. Maria told him about Ricardo and the stolen boots, and Don Carlos's face darkened with anger. "That boy brings shame to this town," he said. "But you're bringing honor to it. Everyone's talking about the brave girl who won't let anything stop her." As they reached the 18-kilometer point, the trail became even more challenging. They were now above the tree line, and the path was mostly loose rock and shale. Each step sent small avalanches of stones tumbling down the mountainside. This was where Maria's lack of boots became most problematic. The loose rocks shifted under her feet, and she had to move much more slowly than the other participants to avoid injury. For the first time since the start, she began to fall behind the main group. Don Carlos stayed with her, offering encouragement and pointing out the safest places to step. "Don't worry about the others," he told her. "This isn't about beating them. This is about beating the mountain." At kilometer 20, they reached the first aid station. A team of volunteer medics were stationed there to treat minor injuries and monitor participants for signs of serious problems. When they saw Maria approaching with blood on her feet, they immediately called her over. "Señorita, we need to examine your feet," said Dr. Martinez, the lead medic. "This is not safe." Maria sat down reluctantly while the doctor cleaned and examined her feet. The damage was significant: cuts on her heels and toes, severe bruising on her soles, and the beginning of some serious blisters. But nothing appeared to be infected or severely injured. "I'm recommending that you withdraw from the march," Dr. Martinez said. "These injuries will only get worse over the remaining 30 kilometers. "Doctor, please," Maria pleaded. "I know my body. I know what I can handle. I've come too far to quit now." "Doctor," Martinez looked at her feet again, then at her determined face. "If you continue, you must promise to stop at every medical station for evaluation, and if any of these cuts show signs of serious infection, you're out immediately. Do you understand?" "Yes, doctor." "Thank you." The medical team cleaned and bandaged her feet as best they could, but they warned her that the bandages wouldn't last long on the rocky trail. Maria accepted this and prepared to continue. As she left the aid station, she saw that a small crowd had gathered. Word of her barefoot march had spread beyond the other participants, and volunteers and spectators were talking about her determination. Some had even started following her progress specifically, cheering when she passed by. The next section of trail was the most technically difficult of the entire course. The path wound along a narrow ridge with steep drops on both sides, and the surface was a mixture of loose rock and exposed granite. Even participants with good boots were struggling with the footing. Maria approached this section with extreme caution. She tested each step carefully, using her hands for balance when necessary. The other participants who had been near her in the rankings pulled ahead during this section, but she didn't care about her position anymore. This had become about something much bigger than winning. Halfway across the ridge, she encountered a problem she hadn't anticipated. A section of trail had been washed out by recent rains, leaving a gap about 3 feet wide that participants had to jump across. For someone wearing boots with good traction, it was a manageable leap. For Maria, with her bandaged feet and uncertain footing, it looked nearly impossible. She stood at the edge of the gap, studying the landing area on the other side. The rocks there looked particularly sharp and unstable. A bad landing could easily break an ankle or cause a serious fall down the mountainside. Other participants who had already crossed the gap stopped to watch, uncertain whether they should help or call for assistance. The tension was palpable as Maria prepared for her attempt. She backed up several steps to get a running start, took 3 deep breaths, and sprinted toward the gap. At the last moment, she launched herself across the void, her arms windmilling for balance as she flew through the mountain air. She landed hard on the rocks on the far side, immediately rolling to absorb the impact. Pain shot through her feet and legs, but she managed to avoid any serious injury. The crowd of participants who had been watching erupted in cheers and applause. "Incredible!" shouted one of the other marchers. "That was the gutsiest thing I've ever seen." Maria stood up carefully, testing her feet. The landing had reopened some of her cuts, and she could feel fresh blood soaking through the bandages, but nothing felt broken, and she was able to put weight on both feet. "I'm okay," she called out to the concerned faces around her. "Just need a moment to catch my breath." As she prepared to continue, a television crew that had been following the march from accessible points reached the area and began filming her. The reporter, a young woman named Isabella, approached with a microphone. "Señorita Santos, you've become the story of this march. What keeps you going despite these incredible challenges?" Maria looked directly into the camera. "I'm doing this for my family, for my community, and for every person who's ever been told they can't achieve something because of where they come from or what they don't have. Sometimes you have to show people that the size of your heart matters more than the price of your equipment." The interview was brief, but it would be broadcast throughout the region that evening, inspiring thousands of people who saw it. As Maria continued along the trail, she began to notice changes in how other participants were treating her. Instead of seeing her as competition, many were now offering encouragement and support. Some shared their water with her, others pointed out hazards along the trail, and a few even offered to carry part of her gear. At the 25-kilometer mark, exactly halfway through the course, Maria reached the highest point of the march. From the summit of Cerro del Aguila, she could see the entire route spread out below her. The town where she had started looked tiny in the distance, and she could trace the winding trail they had followed up into the mountains. More importantly, she could see the trail that lay ahead. The next 25 kilometers would be mostly downhill, which would be easier on her cardiovascular system, but potentially harder on her injured feet. The downhill sections would put different stresses on her wounds and might cause new problems. But standing there on the summit, with the wind blowing through her hair and the entire valley spread out below her, Maria felt a surge of confidence and pride. She had made it halfway. She was going to finish this march. At the summit checkpoint, she met up with Don Carlos again. He had been worried about her during the technical ridge section and was relieved to see her arrive safely. "How do you feel, Niña?" he asked. "Like I can do anything," Maria replied, and she meant it. The descent began immediately after the summit, and Maria quickly discovered that downhill hiking barefoot presented its own unique challenges. The constant braking motion required to control her speed put enormous pressure on her toes and the balls of her feet, areas that were already tender from the climb. But she also discovered advantages to her situation. Without the rigid soles of hiking boots, she could feel every variation in the terrain and adjust her footing accordingly. Her bare feet had become incredibly sensitive to the trail surface, allowing her to find the most stable path almost instinctively. At kilometer 30, she caught up with Ricardo. He was sitting beside the trail, looking defeated and exhausted. Her stolen boots lay beside him. He had finally given up trying to wear them over his own shoes. His feet were covered in blisters, and he looked like he was seriously considering quitting the march. When he saw Maria approaching, his face flushed with shame and anger. "This is all your fault," he muttered. "If you hadn't made such a big deal about those stupid boots." Maria stopped and looked down at him. Her feet were bloody and bandaged, her clothes were dirty and torn, but her eyes were bright with determination and strength. "Those boots were never going to help you," she said calmly. "This march isn't one with equipment, it's one with heart, and that's something you can't steal from anyone." She picked up her boots from where he had discarded them. They were scuffed and dirty from his misuse, but they were still hers. For a moment, She considered putting them on. But then she looked at her bandaged feet and realized something important. She had come this far without them. She had proven to herself and everyone else that she didn't need them to succeed. Putting them on now would somehow diminish what she had accomplished. Instead, she tied the laces together and slung the boots over her shoulder. She would carry them to the finish line. But she would complete this march the way she had started it. On her own terms. With her own strength. You can still finish, she told Ricardo. It's not too late to do something good today. Without waiting for his response, she continued down the trail. Behind her, Ricardo sat in stunned silence, watching the girl he had tried to humiliate disappear around a bend in the mountain path. As Maria approached the final section of the course, word of her achievement had spread throughout the region. Radio stations were broadcasting updates on her progress, and people were driving to various points along the route to cheer for her. The simple charity march had become something much larger. A story about perseverance and courage that was inspiring thousands of people. But Maria was unaware of the attention she was attracting. She was focused entirely on putting one foot in front of the other, on managing her pain, and on reaching the finish line. Her feet felt like they were on fire. Her legs were cramping from the constant adjustment required to run on uneven surfaces. And she was becoming dangerously dehydrated. At the 35-kilometer aid station, the medical team was waiting for her with serious concern. Dr. Martinez examined her feet again and found that several of the cuts had become infected despite their earlier treatment. Maria, you have to stop, he said firmly. These infections could become serious if not treated properly. You've already accomplished something incredible. Maria looked at her feet, which were now more bandage than skin. She knew the doctor was right from a medical standpoint, but she also knew that quitting now, with only 15 kilometers to go, would haunt her for the rest of her life. Doctor, can you give me antibiotics and pain medication? She asked. Something to help me finish this? Dr. Martinez struggled with the decision. As a medical professional, he knew he should force her to withdraw. But as a human being, he understood what this march meant to her and to the thousands of people who were now following her story. I can give you something for the pain and infection, he said finally. But you have to promise me that if you feel faint, or if the pain becomes unbearable, you'll stop immediately, and you have to check in with the medical team at every remaining checkpoint. I promise, doctor. As the medication began to take effect, Maria felt a renewed surge of energy. The worst of the pain in her feet subsided, though she could still feel every cut and bruise. More importantly, she felt mentally refreshed and ready for the final push to the finish line. The last 15 kilometers of the course took the trail down through mountain meadows and along a series of gentle switchbacks toward the town. It was the easiest section of the entire route, which was fortunate because Maria was running on pure willpower at this point. As she entered the final stretch, she began to encounter more and more spectators. Word of her barefoot march had reached the town, and people were lining the trail to cheer for her. Children ran alongside her for short distances, and adults called out encouragement and support. At kilometer 45, with just 5 kilometers to go, something unexpected happened. Don Carlos, who had been walking near her for much of the march, suddenly stumbled and fell. He had been pushing himself hard to keep up with her pace, and the effort had finally caught up with him. Maria immediately stopped and knelt beside him. Don Carlos, are you okay? The elderly man was conscious but clearly exhausted and possibly dehydrated. Go on, Niña, he whispered. You're so close. Don't worry about an old man. I'm not leaving you, Maria said firmly. She signaled to other participants who were nearby. And together, they helped Don Carlos to his feet. She supported him as they walked slowly toward the next checkpoint, where medical personnel could evaluate his condition. This act of selflessness, stopping to help a fellow marcher when victory was within her grasp, would become legendary in the town's history. It perfectly captured the spirit that had carried her through the entire ordeal. At the final checkpoint, Don Carlos was treated for dehydration and exhaustion. He would be fine, but he wouldn't be able to finish the march. As the medical team prepared to transport him back to town, he grabbed Maria's hand. You finish this, Niña. You finish this for all of us who can't. Maria nodded, tears in her eyes. I will, Don Carlos. I promise. With 3 kilometers to go, Maria could see the town in the distance. The trail had leveled out completely, and she was now walking on dirt roads that led back to the central square where the march had begun 12 hours earlier. Her feet were completely numb from the pain medication, which was both a blessing and a curse. She couldn't feel the pain anymore, but she also couldn't feel where she was stepping, which made it difficult to avoid holes and obstacles in the road. The crowds were getting larger as she approached the town. Someone had set up speakers along the route, and music was playing to encourage the final participants. Maria could hear her name being chanted by spectators who had heard about her story. As she entered the town limits, she was joined by dozens of local children who ran alongside her, treating her like a returning hero. Their enthusiasm gave her a final burst of energy for the last kilometer. The finish line came into view as she turned the corner into the town square. A huge crowd had gathered, including local officials, media representatives, and hundreds of townspeople who had come to witness the conclusion of her incredible journey. But as Maria approached the finish line, she realized that this march had become about much more than winning prize money or proving a point. It had become a symbol of what was possible when someone refused to let circumstances define their limitations. She crossed the finish line to thunderous applause, her stolen boots still hanging from her shoulder, her feet bloody and bandaged but carrying her to a victory that no one who witnessed it would ever forget. The moment Maria crossed the finish line, the crowd erupted in the loudest cheer the annual march had ever received. People were crying, clapping, and shouting her name. Camera flashes went off from every direction as photographers captured the image that would appear on newspaper front pages across the country the next day. A 17-year-old girl with bandaged feet, holding her stolen boots above her head in triumph. Don Alberto, the race organizer, was waiting at the finish line with tears streaming down his face. In 30 years of organizing this event, he had never seen anything like what Maria had just accomplished. He wrapped a finisher's medal around her neck and helped her to a chair where the medical team could immediately begin treating her feet. "Maria Santos," he announced over the loudspeaker, his voice breaking with emotion. "You have shown us today what the human spirit can achieve. You have honored not just yourself and your family, but our entire community." As Dr. Martinez and his team worked to clean and properly dress Maria's wounded feet, the results of the march were being calculated. Maria had not only finished the course, she had placed 7th overall out of more than 200 participants. Her time of 8 hours and 43 minutes was remarkable under normal circumstances, but considering she had completed the entire 50 kilometers barefoot, it was nothing short of miraculous. More importantly, she had qualified for the prize money. The top 10 finishers each received cash awards, with first place earning $5,000 and decreasing amounts for lower positions. Maria's 7th place finish earned her $1,500, not the full amount she had hoped for, but enough to pay for her final year of school and contribute significantly to her brother's medical expenses. As news of her achievement spread, people began arriving at the town square from neighboring villages. The story of the barefoot girl who refused to quit was resonating far beyond the boundaries of her small community. Local television stations sent crews to interview her, and by evening, national news programs were picking up the story. Isabella, the reporter who had interviewed Maria on the mountain, approached her again as the medical team finished treating her feet. "Maria, the entire country is talking about what you did today. How do you feel about becoming a symbol of perseverance and determination?" Maria, still sitting in the chair with her feet elevated and wrapped in fresh bandages, looked thoughtful. "I never set out to be a symbol of anything. I just wanted to help my family and prove to myself that I could do something difficult. But if my story helps other people believe they can overcome their obstacles, then I'm grateful for that." What would you say to someone who's facing their own impossible challenge? "I would tell them that the mountain doesn't care what shoes you're wearing," Maria replied, a slight smile crossing her tired face. "It only cares about how strong your heart is and how badly you want to reach the top." As the interview concluded, Maria's family arrived at the square. Her mother Carmen pushed through the crowd with tears streaming down her face, followed by her father Miguel and her 3 sisters. They had been listening to radio updates throughout the day, hardly believing what they were hearing about their daughter and sister. "Mija, what have you done?" her mother cried, embracing her carefully so as not to disturb her injured feet. "We were so worried, but we are so proud." Her father, a quiet man who worked construction jobs when he could find them, knelt beside her chair. "Maria, you have brought honor to our family name. Your children will grow up knowing their mother is someone who never gives up." Her youngest sister, 8-year-old Sophia, looked at Maria's bandaged feet with wide eyes. "Did it hurt terribly, Maria?" Bar? Only when I stopped to think about it," Maria replied, ruffling Sophia's hair. "Most of the time I was too busy moving forward to notice the pain." As the family reunion continued, a commotion near the edge of the square caught everyone's attention. Ricardo had finally arrived at the finish line, more than 2 hours after Maria. He looked exhausted and defeated, his expensive gear dirty and his confidence shattered. When he saw the celebration surrounding Maria, his face flushed with shame. Several townspeople who knew what he had done began pointing and whispering. The story of the stolen boots had spread along with news of Maria's achievement, and Ricardo was finding himself the target of disapproving looks and angry comments. Don Alberto noticed the tension building and decided to address the situation directly. He approached Ricardo with a stern expression. "Young man, I understand you were responsible for taking this young woman's boots this morning." Ricardo looked around at the hostile faces surrounding him and realized he couldn't deny what everyone already knew. "It was supposed to be a joke," he mumbled. "I didn't think she would actually try to do the march without them." "A joke?" Don Alberto's voice carried across the square. "You call sabotaging another competitor's equipment a joke? You call trying to destroy someone's dreams funny?" The crowd began to murmur angrily, and for a moment it looked like the situation might turn ugly. But then Maria's voice cut through the tension. "Stop," she said, struggling to stand despite her injured feet. "This isn't what today should be about." Quote, she hobbled toward Ricardo, her family and friends moving to support her. When she reached him, the entire square fell silent, waiting to see what she would do. "Ricardo," she said, looking him directly in the eyes, "what you did was wrong. It was cruel, and it was meant to hurt me. But I want you to understand something. You didn't steal my boots today. You gave me something much more valuable." Ricardo looked confused and ashamed, unable to meet her gaze. "You gave me the chance to discover how strong I really am," Maria continued. "You gave me the opportunity to show my community and my family what I'm capable of. You gave me a story I'll tell my grandchildren someday. So in a way, I should thank you." The crowd was stunned by her grace and maturity. Even Ricardo looked up at her with surprise and something that might have been respect. "But I want you to promise me something," Maria added. "I want you to promise that you'll never again try to tear someone else down to make yourself feel bigger. The world has enough obstacles without people creating new ones for each other." Ricardo nodded slowly, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "I promise, Maria. I'm sorry. I'm really, really sorry." Maria extended her hand to him, and after a moment's hesitation, he shook it. The crowd, following her example of forgiveness, began to disperse peacefully. As evening fell, a celebration began in the town square. Local musicians arrived with guitars and drums, vendors set up stands selling food and drinks, and what had started as a finish line ceremony transformed into a community-wide festival honoring Maria's achievement. The mayor, who had been out of town during the march, arrived and announced that the town would be commissioning a statue to commemorate Maria's Barefoot March. "This young woman has put our town on the map," he declared. "Her story will inspire people for generations to come." As the celebration continued around her, Maria sat quietly with her family, finally allowing herself to fully absorb what had happened. The pain medication was wearing off, and she was beginning to feel every cut and bruise on her feet, but she was also feeling something else. A profound sense of accomplishment and self-knowledge. "Doctor." Martinez approached her one final time to check on her condition. "How are you feeling, Maria?" "Tired," she admitted. "And my feet feel like they're on fire. But I've never felt stronger in my life." "You'll need to stay off your feet for at least a week," he warned. "Some of those cuts were quite deep, and we want to make sure everything heals properly." "A week of rest sounds wonderful," Maria laughed. "But after that, I think I'd like to start training for next year's march. Next year? Dr. Martinez looked shocked. After what you went through today? Next year I'll have proper boots, Maria said with a grin. I can't wait to see what I can do when I'm properly equipped. As the evening progressed, Maria found herself surrounded by people wanting to hear her story and congratulate her achievement. Children from the neighborhood gathered around her chair, listening with wide eyes as she described the most challenging moments of the march. A young girl about her own age approached shyly. Maria, I heard what you did today, and I wanted to tell you something. I was planning to drop out of school next month to help my family with money. But after hearing about your march, I think I'm going to find another way. If you can walk 50 kilometers barefoot, I can find a way to finish my education. Similar conversations happened throughout the evening. Maria's story was already beginning to inspire others in the community to reconsider their own limitations and challenges. As the celebration wound down and families began heading home, Maria's father carried her to a truck that would take them back to their small house. As they drove through the quiet streets, she reflected on the incredible day. 12 hours earlier, she had been a 17-year-old girl from the poorest neighborhood, worried about how her family would survive the coming year. Now she was returning home as a local hero, with prize money in her pocket and a story that would be remembered long after she was gone. But more than the money or the recognition, Maria had gained something invaluable: absolute confidence in her own strength and determination. She had learned that she could overcome obstacles that seemed impossible, that she could endure pain and hardship in pursuit of her goals, and that sometimes the worst things that happen to us can become the catalyst for our greatest achievements. When they reached home, her mother helped her into bed and brought her a warm meal. As she ate, Maria looked around at the small room she shared with her sisters, at the worn furniture and patched walls that had always seemed like signs of poverty to her before. Tonight, they looked like home. They looked like the foundation from which she had launched herself towards something extraordinary. Her youngest sister, Sophia, climbed onto the bed beside her. Maria, when I grow up, I want to be brave like you. You already are brave, Sophia, Maria replied, hugging her sister carefully. Every day we wake up and try to make things better for our family. That's brave. Today I just got to be brave in a way that everyone could see. As her family settled in for the night, Maria lay awake thinking about the future. The prize money would help with immediate expenses, but she knew this march had opened doors for her that went far beyond the financial reward. Already, several scholarship programs had contacted the family after hearing her story. A sports equipment company had offered to sponsor her future athletic endeavors, and a local business leader had approached her father about a job opportunity that would provide steady income for the family. But perhaps most importantly, Maria had proven to herself that she was capable of achieving things that seemed impossible. Whatever challenges lay ahead in her life, she would face them with the knowledge that she had once walked 50 kilometers on bare feet and refused to quit. The stolen boots sat in the corner of the room, cleaned and repaired by her father. Tomorrow she would put them away carefully, saving them as a reminder of the day she discovered she didn't need them to accomplish extraordinary things. Outside her window, the mountains where she had spent the day rose dark and silent against the starlit sky. The trails she had walked were empty now, waiting for next year's marchers. But they had been changed by her passage, just as she had been changed by walking them. Maria closed her eyes and smiled, her feet throbbing with pain but her heart full of pride and possibility. Tomorrow she would begin planning for next year's march, but tonight she would rest, knowing that she had proven something important to herself and to everyone who doubted her. Sometimes the best victories come not from having everything you need, but from making the most of what you have. Sometimes the greatest strength is found not in expensive equipment, but in the determination to keep moving forward, no matter what obstacles appear in your path. And sometimes, when someone tries to steal your boots, the best response is to show them you never really needed boots to reach your destination in the first place. The Barefoot girl had become a legend, but more importantly, she had become exactly who she was meant to be. Strong, determined, and absolutely unbeatable when it came to achieving her dreams.